Hey guys, welcome back. Today I want to take a little bit of time to talk to you about the carbon cycle. We've already discussed how the water cycle works. We've discussed how the rock cycle works. And now I'm going to move on to the carbon cycle. So we hear a lot about carbon and how it affects the atmosphere and how it's, causing climate change and warming up the planet. We call that global warming and things like that going on. So what exactly is going on with the carbon cycle, and why are those kind of things happening? I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about climate change as far as this goes, but I do want to talk about how this carbon moves in and out of our atmosphere and kind of just cycles through the whole process here on Earth. So we can start out looking at the carbon cycle. We could start anywhere on this cycle and talk about it. So let's start right here. So we know that we have carbon in the air. A lot of it is in the form of what we call carbon dioxide and other carbohydrates, if you want to think about that. But basically what happens is plants use carbon dioxide that they take in from the air, and through the process of photosynthesis, they store that in their body as a carbohydrate. It's also known as sugar. Think about maple syrup, for example. So maple syrup is really sweet. It's really good. I love it on pancakes and waffles and things like that. But that's what happens. That carbon that we have in the air around us, these plants are taking it in and converting it into basically a fuel source for their bodies to grow and develop and become trees or whatever kind of plants they are. Now, sometimes plants die and they rot. And in the process of doing that, they release carbon back into the air. So all that carbon is stored inside those plants. When they die, well, they get put back into the air if they just lay there and rot. Sometimes they get buried in the ground and are converted into what we call fossil fuels. So think, for example, if this tree dies and it gets buried like in a swamp or something like that, as time goes by, the carbon that plant was made out of could convert into something, say, like coal or oil, or natural gas or things like that. From there, these fossil fuels normally would stay underneath the earth. So a lot of the carbon we have in our atmosphere normally in times past would have been taken up by plants, and as they died and got buried underground, it would have just been stored there. Now what we're doing, though, in the past few hundred years or so, is we're taking a lot of that buried carbon, and we call it fossil fuels, and we're burning those and releasing that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Now normally, you want carbon to go back into the atmosphere. We have forest fires, things like that return a lot of it to the atmosphere, and volcanoes, as they erupt, release carbon dioxide a lot of times. So we have that cycle going over and over a lot of times. But for now, one of the big problems we're having is we're digging up a whole lot of this carbon out of the ground and using it for fossil fuels really quickly. I mean, we all need electricity. We all like to have our cell phones and things like that, and the processes of making that kind of stuff, and fuel for our vehicles, to heat our houses, things like that. All that, building things like your house, anything. It requires that we use a lot of fossil fuels, which in turn is releasing a lot of that carbon into the air. Now, remember we said carbohydrates are formed by plants as well. So these carbohydrates oftentimes are eaten and used by other animals. So for example, cows eat grass. Grass does photosynthesis. It takes carbon dioxide from the air and forms what we call carbohydrates. Cows and other animals eat the grass. In some cases, you eat plants too. Think about corn and lettuce and things like that. So you might get that carbohydrate straight from the plant itself. Now, we also can get it another way. So the cows and deer and things like that eat these plants, eventually they get eaten by something else. Think about when you're eating a steak or a burger or something like that. What you're actually getting is you're getting the proteins and things that it was made out of, but you're also getting the carbohydrates, that carbon that the animal itself got from the plants that did photosynthesis. So in the process of doing that, you're now taking in those carbohydrates yourself. And generally what happens is that it gets returned to the atmosphere either when we die and release it that way, but it's usually returned to the atmosphere through what we call respiration. Now, the simplified version of respiration is what we call breathing. But the real version of that is actually our cells the mitochondria taking those carbohydrates and using it for fuel, and which in return it releases carbon dioxide, which we breathe back out into the atmosphere. So when you breathe out, when I breathe out, a cow, a chipmunk, a squirrel, a fish, it doesn't matter. If it's a living thing, we're releasing carbon back into the air in the form usually of carbon dioxide. Now, another problem with all this carbon that we're releasing into the air, digging up fossil fuels, happens with the ocean. So let's talk about that for a moment. So some of the carbon is absorbed by the ocean, where aquatic plants and animals use it, or it returns to the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide can cycle into the ocean and back out. Now, the problem that we're having now is where we're releasing so much carbon dioxide into the air is that we're actually starting to raise the amount of carbon dioxide absorbed by the ocean. Normally, you would think maybe that's not a big deal, but the problem with that is that it causes the ocean water to become acidic. Now, it's already slightly acidic as it is, so most of the plants and stuff are already used to it. But as it becomes more and more acidic, it becomes harder and harder for plants and certain animals in the ocean to be able to survive. So that's kind of the carbon cycle in a nutshell. Basically, is carbon dioxide is normally found in our atmosphere. We take it in when we eat things. Plants take it in when they produce food for themselves, and then we eat the plants. We get it that way, or we eat animals that eat the plants. It can be stored underground, where it usually forms fossil fuels, and then we put it back into the atmosphere through there, and it should be at a good balance. But unfortunately, as of the past few hundred years, like I said, we're not at a good balance with it. We're putting way more in the atmosphere than can be absorbed over time. If we could find some better fuel source and stop using these, our carbon dioxide levels would eventually balance back out as plants absorbed it and took it back into the earth. But that's pretty much the carbon cycle. I will post any links to videos you guys need to go with that.